The church was cold for a June morning, and Cecily Brant stood at the rear of the nave in a gown the color of sea fog, listening to the sound of a congregation that had not come to celebrate anything. She could see him from where she stood. He waited at the altar with his back to the room, his hands loose at his sides, and the stillness of him was so complete that it seemed less like patience, and more like a man who had learned, at considerable cost, to stop expecting the world to adjust itself to his preferences. He was taller than she had imagined, broader through the shoulder than the rumors had implied. The navy of his coat was almost severe, and his dark hair lay slightly too long against his collar, and the congregation made that specific, murmuring silence around him that meant they were watching, but would not acknowledge watching. She had heard the stories, of course. A steward dismissed without a letter of reference, his family left without a quarterly wage midwinter, a neighbor who had asked for the use of a field road and received no reply for 11 months. A look at the Alderton assembly that had driven Lady Price to leave before the second set. The Viscount Fenmore, the whispers ran, was not cruel in the way that drew attention to itself. He was cold in the way that simply withdrew every warmth the room had to offer, leaving the space around him degrees colder than it had been before he entered. She had been given to him in 11 days. Her father's solicitor had called it a settlement. Her mother had called it a great opportunity, though her mother's eyes had not agreed with her mouth. Her older brother Philip had said nothing at all, which told Cecily everything she had needed to know about what the family believed she was owed. The debt had sat against the Brant estate for 3 years, and the Viscount Fenmore had held it without pressing, and then, 6 weeks prior, he had offered terms. The terms were one word: Cecily. She had not wept. It had not seemed to her that weeping was the appropriate response to being made into a solution to a problem one had not created. The footman at the church door moved to hand her in, and she had gathered herself to take his arm when a shadow crossed the stone at the threshold, and the footman stepped back without being told. She looked up. The Viscount had crossed the nave. He stood at the door now, not smiling. His face, arranged in the grave, contained expression she would come to know as his default, and he offered her his arm without a word. His dark eyes met hers for 3 seconds. She was aware, in a way she could not afterward explain, of the warmth of his forearm through the wool of his sleeve, even through the thickness of her glove. She set her hand on his arm and he walked her down the aisle, and nobody in the congregation said a word. Later, at the wedding breakfast, she sat at the long table and listened to Lady Fenmore, her new mother-in-law, murmur to a cousin behind the screen of a raised fan. The Brant arrangement suits no one, but it will hold. Cecily ate a small piece of salmon and looked at the flowers on the table, which were white and very correct, and she told herself that holding was enough, that a thing which held was not nothing, that she did not require anything beyond what she had agreed to, which was a roof, a position, and the discharge of her family's debt. She told herself these things with some precision, and did not look at her husband, who sat at the head of the table and spoke to no one. The carriage that brought them to Fenmore House rode for 3 hours along roads that grew progressively narrower, and the countryside progressively greener, and then it turned between stone gate posts, and moved up a long drive through grounds that were clearly tended, though in a way that suggested the grounds were maintained out of duty rather than love. The house was large, stone, gray-fronted, 3 stories, with windows that faced east and caught the afternoon sun at an oblique angle that made them look at this hour like closed eyes. It was not unwelcoming, exactly. It simply did not offer itself. Mrs. Laker, the housekeeper, met them at the door with 2 footmen and a housemaid, whose expression was carefully neutral. The staff were arranged in a line, and Cecily walked along it and tried to find faces rather than uniforms. She found one face, a girl of perhaps 15 at the end of the row, whose hands were red at the knuckles, and who looked, when Cecily met her eyes, as though she expected to be found wanting. Cecily smiled at her. The girl blinked and looked at the floor. The house smelled of beeswax and cold stone and, somewhere deeper, the particular complex smell of many fires burning in many rooms over many years. Cecily was shown to a sitting room, given tea, and left alone. She did not sit. She walked the perimeter of the room, which had good proportions and furniture that suggested taste in a previous generation and less attention since, and then she stopped at the window seat, where someone had left a book. She almost did not look at it. She was reaching for the tea when the angle of the light caught the spine, a small leather book, worn pale at the corners, held at a specific page by a red ribbon that had been tied with a particular kind of careful attention that people give to things they are afraid to lose. She did not open it. She set her teacup down on the tray, lifted the book carefully by its spine, and set it on the windowsill where it had been, slightly back from the edge, where it would not fall. She did not know, then, what it was. She only knew it was tended. She was still studying the room when the door opened. Slowly, without a knock, a boy of 8 or thereabouts stood in the doorway. He was slight, with dark eyes that would have looked like his guardian's if they had been less frightened, and he wore a plain brown jacket and held in one hand a piece of paper folded twice. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "Good afternoon." He did not speak. He took one step forward, extended the folded paper, and waited. She crossed to him and took it. He had drawn, in pencil, a wren perched on a window ledge. "Is this from downstairs?" she said. "Did you draw this today?" He nodded once. "It's very good," she said, and she meant it because it was good. The proportions were attentive, the eye rendered with a small sure mark that caught the bird's particular aliveness. He looked at her a moment longer, then turned and left without a sound. That night she heard footsteps in the corridor at 9:30, measured and unhurried, and then the faint sound of a door, and then nothing. She told herself this house was manageable. She lay in a very clean, very cold bed and looked at the canopy, and told herself that managing was what she was here for, and that she had never required warmth as a condition of survival, and that the sound of footsteps at 9:30 meant nothing at all. In the village of Fenmore, 3 days into her marriage, she went with Mrs. Laker to inspect the shops, and afterwards stepped into the draper's alone while the housekeeper arranged something with the butcher. She stood examining a bolt of cream muslin when the draper's wife, who did not yet know who she was, began to talk to her cousin across the counter about the Viscount up at the house. The cousin clucked sympathetically. The draper's wife shook her head. "The steward," she said, was the clearest evidence. Merton, his name was. Turned out mid-November with no reference and 3 children, and the Viscount had not offered so much as a character to help the man find another position, and the family had been seen begging bread from the vicar's housekeeper. One did not treat a man who had served faithfully for 6 years in such a manner, unless one was at root, without feeling. Cecily set down the muslin. She thanked the draper's wife, who had just noticed her and gone the color of chalk, and walked back out into the November air. She wanted, very much, to be calm about it. She arranged her reasoning as she walked. She had known the stories. She had known the kind of man she was marrying. The specific shape of his cruelty was new, and the name Merton was new, and the 3 children were new, but the category was not new. She had prepared herself for this category. At dinner, she watched him. He sat at the far end of the long table, his face composed, his movements spare. He did not speak unless spoken to, and when he spoke, it was in the level, contained register of a man who has decided that the shortest route between 2 points is the most defensible. He ate without apparent pleasure. He did not, she noticed, take wine. Thomas sat at the near end of the table closer to Cecily, and ate his soup with the careful concentration of a child who has been taught not to spill. Aldrich watched him, twice, without appearing to watch. The first time, Thomas set his spoon down to look at something outside the window, and Aldrich's dark eyes moved to the boy and sat there, quiet and attentive, until the boy picked up his spoon again. The second time, Thomas dropped his bread and it fell under the table, and before the footman could move, the Viscount had said in a low voice, "Leave it." And the footman stilled, and he continued, his eyes returning to his plate as though nothing had occurred, and the bread remained on the floor. and Thomas was spared the particular humiliation of watching a grown man scramble beneath the table on his behalf. She did not know what to do with that. She filed it alongside the Wren drawing and the careful red ribbon in the cabinet of things she was not yet sure how to classify. She had been a careful filer her whole life. Her mother had called it her best quality, and her father had called it her most useful one, which were, she had understood even at 12, two different compliments. She filed. The way the servants at Fenmore House glanced at their master, and then away, which was not the glance of servants who feared their employer, but of servants who were not certain yet whether trust was something they were permitted. The way the fire in the hall was always tended before the fire in the study, which suggested someone had decided that the corridor cold mattered, that the people who moved through it were worth the coal. Small things. Things that resisted the shape of the story she had agreed to inhabit. She rose from the dining table each evening, with the composed face she had brought from her mother's house, and she went to her sitting room, and she sat at the small desk, and she wrote letters to her sister, which contained none of this, and she looked at the Wren drawing, pinned to the wall, and she thought she did not know what she was doing here. This was, she had begun to suspect, quite different from not knowing what she was worth. She woke at 2 in the morning, and lay still for a moment, listening. The house was quiet. She thought she heard from somewhere below a voice, very low and very measured speaking. She rose. She pulled her wrapper around her and took the candle from the nightstand and walked down the corridor to the stairs and then down 2 flights to the library. The door stood an inch open, and light came through the gap, warm and amber, not from the great fireplace but from a single lamp placed on the table beside 2 armchairs drawn close together. Aldrich sat in the larger chair, still dressed, without his coat, in his waistcoat and shirt sleeves, and he held in his hands the small, worn leather book she had replaced on the windowsill 3 days ago. Thomas sat curled in the smaller chair beside him, wrapped in a blanket, his dark eyes half open, with the particular drowsy attention of a child who knows that being awake a little longer is permitted. Aldrich was reading. She had not expected his voice to sound like that. In conversation, it was contained and clipped. Reading. He allowed it. Room. It was low, and it moved with the rhythm of the prose without performing it, and it was. She understood with a small, precise shock the voice of someone who did it not for the sake of hearing himself, but for the sake of being heard. She did not move. She stood in the corridor and listened, and did not count the minutes, and the fire in the library made a soft sound, and Thomas's eyes closed and closed again, and Aldrich read on, turning pages, and the house around them was entirely still. Thomas fell asleep. Aldrich sat for a moment without moving. Then he closed the book around the red ribbon. Then he reached across and set his large, capable hand on the boy's hair. Once, with a care so deliberate, it was almost anguished, and held it there for 3 breaths. Then he took his hand away and sat back, and his face in the lamplight was the face of a man who has believed for a long time that he has no right to what he just permitted himself, and has not yet found his way to being wrong about that. Cecily took a step back from the door. Then another. She walked back up the stairs in the dark without the candle, which she had forgotten to light, and she sat on the edge of her bed and held very still, and tried to sort through the cabinet of things she had been filing for 3 days, and found that it would not sort. She found him in the library the next morning. He was at the desk, writing, and he looked up when she entered, with an expression that suggested he had not anticipated company, but was not, precisely, opposed to it. She said, "Does Thomas draw often?" Something shifted in his face. It was small, and it was swift, and it was the second time she had seen that specific alteration. The sense of a man recalibrating against something he had not expected. He said every day he keeps the drawings in a portfolio under the window seat in his room. Mrs. Laker has not told him to stop, and I have not offered an opinion. He drew me a wren, she said. There is a wren's nest in this room. On the outside sill I have kept that window latched. She looked at the window. It was, indeed, latched, though the room was not warm enough to require it. So the bird would not be disturbed, she said. He said nothing which she had come to understand was his form of confirmation. She sat in the smaller chair which was still angled toward the larger one from the night before, and she said, "I heard you last night reading to him." His pen stilled on the page. "I did not mean to intrude," she said. "I could not sleep, and went to the corridor." The door was not fully closed. He set the pen down. He looked at the desk rather than at her, and she watched the line of his jaw in the morning light, and thought about how a face could be so consistently grave and yet not be cruel. The features she had arranged in her imagination into coldness refused, up close to hold that arrangement. The book belonged to his father, he said. He said it the way one sets down something very heavy and does not want to put it down. Captain Corby, we read together at school. In the same way, he said it was the only method by which Latin had ever made sense to him. When Thomas stopped speaking, I did not know what else to try. She waited. Corby died in the autumn of last year, he said, of a fever. He had been traveling in bad weather, and the fever took hold before anyone understood what it was, and he was gone in 8 days. He was quiet for a moment. He had been carrying a letter of mine. The journey was on my errand. He did not say the rest. He did not say that he held himself responsible. He did not say that the boy's silence lived inside his own, that the grief was shared and he could not find the way through it. He did not say any of it, because he was not a man who said such things, and perhaps had never been. He simply sat with the weight of it in the set of his shoulders, and the particular stillness of his hands on the desk. She said, "Does he have paper in his room?" "Good paper, not the brown kind." Aldrich looked up. "If he draws every day," she said, "the brown paper is rough on his pencils." "I have some green cartridge paper in my trunk that I brought for letters. I will not use all of it. I could leave some outside his door." He looked at her for a long moment. She could not read the look. It was not the cold, contained expression she had catalogued, and it was not the tentative softness she had seen in the library. It was something else, something more careful, the look of a man who has decided to revise a conclusion he was almost certain of. He said that would be, I think, very welcome. If the women of the Tun could have told her where to look, for what she could not name in the days that followed, they would not have suggested the library. They would not have suggested the place where she sat across from a silent man and shared the room's morning quiet, in the particular way that two people share a room when they have each decided, separately and without announcement, to stop flinching at the other's presence. She left paper outside Thomas's door. The next morning, a drawing appeared outside hers. 2 small figures at a table, their heads bent over something the pencil had not specified. Prod. If she had been the sort of woman who wept at small things, she might have wept. She was not that sort of woman. She pinned the drawing to the wall of her sitting room beside the window and went downstairs to breakfast. There are moments in a story, she told herself, when you realize the story you thought you were inside is not the story you are actually inside. You do not always know, in those moments, whether the new story is better or worse. She was not yet sure. She thought sometimes that being not sure was already a different country from the one she had left. If you have ever been told that the most important discoveries come from what you were not looking for, you will understand something of what the following weeks gave her. She was not looking for reasons to revise the story. She had accepted the story. Acceptance, she had believed, was a virtue. It required so much less of a person than hope did. Aldrich did not explain himself. She learned this firmly, and she learned also that the absence of explanation was not the same as the absence of reason. The cook's quarterly review came to her through a study door that was not quite closed, and found that he had corrected a calculation error without the cook knowing it had been corrected, had simply read back the right figure, without indicating whose arithmetic had been wrong. And the cook had gone away with his wages intact, and his dignity intact, and no knowledge of either. She noticed the scullery maid's coat, a fine wool thing, clearly too good for the position, and when she asked Mrs. Laker where it had come from, the housekeeper's expression went briefly warm, and then professional again. And she said it had been a household expense, which was not true, and Cecily knew it was not true, and filed it. The story of the dismissed steward, which she turned over in her mind like a stone one, is ordinary. She had almost found her way to asking him directly when the night of the assembly dinner arrived. The Viscount's mother had planned it for early December, a gathering of 30 or so at Fenmore House, and Cecily had prepared for it with the particular readiness of someone who understands that being watched is simply a condition of her current life and who has learned in the days since her marriage to be watched without flinching. She put on her best gown, which was cream with a gold ribbon at the waist, and she let Nan dress her hair, and she stood in front of the glass and told herself she looked well enough. Nan was a careful girl. She had come with Cecily from the Brandt house, which meant she had seen the particular form of management that had characterized Cecily's domestic life since the age of 15. And she had come without complaint. And she had, in the weeks since their arrival at Fenmore House, assembled a careful understanding of the household's workings without drawing attention to the process. She knew, for instance, that the kitchen fire was kept higher than Lady Fenmore had originally ordered it, and she knew why. And she had reported this to Cecily one morning with the specific expression of someone who is updating a file and is not yet certain what the update means. She knew also, apparently, what the downstairs staff said among themselves. Cecily had not asked. She had believed, on balance, that the things she did not ask were the things she was not prepared to receive. The previous weeks had given her more than she had arrived expecting, and she had moved through each new piece of evidence with a steadiness she was proud of, and a carefulness she privately understood to be close kin to fear. She did not fear hope. She feared what happened to a person when hope was incorrect. She sat at the dressing table and watched Nan's hands in the glass, and breathed evenly, and prepared herself for a drawing room of 30 people, who would look at the Viscount's wife and see, as they had always seen, the arrangement. Nan paused behind her with a last pin. She said, very carefully, "My lady, I ought to tell you what they say downstairs. I would rather you heard it from me." Cecily met her eyes in the glass. "They say," Nan said, "that the Brandt arrangement was the Viscount's price for settling your father's debt. Nothing more." Cecily sat very still. "I do not believe it," Nan said, "for what my believing is worth." "Thank you," Cecily said. She picked up her gloves and did not look at herself in the glass. Again, the drawing room was warm, which she noticed the way one notices a room's warmth when one has been cold. For a long time, Mrs. Hargrove arrived with her husband and their daughter and a friend of the daughter's, and Lady Fenmore received them with the smooth authority of a woman for whom receiving has never been anything other than a form of power. Cecily stood at a slight angle to the room, near the piano, and watched the guests arrange themselves. Mrs. Hargrove found her within the first quarter hour. She was a handsome woman of 45, with the particular confidence of someone who has decided that the room exists to be navigated on her terms. She looked at Cecily with a small, pleasant smile and said to the woman beside her, loud enough to carry, "Miss Brandt, or I suppose she is, Lady Fenmore now, has always been the Brandt arrangement, has she not?" The sort one makes when there are no better options. The woman beside Mrs. Hargrove laughed softly and looked away. Lady Fenmore did not correct her. Cecily kept her chin level. She said nothing. She was very good at saying nothing, having practiced it her entire life. And her face showed the room only what she chose to show it. Later, she was crossing the corridor to collect a shawl when she heard, through a door, Lady Fenmore's voice, calm and considered. "The arrangement can still be managed, Aldrich, if you would only pursue the Pelham connection. Less. The girl is agreeable. She would not make difficulties. The Brandt business has been handled. There are quieter ways to proceed from here." A silence. Then nothing. The absence of his voice hit her low in the chest, somewhere below the gold ribbon. She had prepared for Mrs. Hargrove. She had prepared for Lady Fenmore. She had not fully prepared for this, for the silence that could mean anything, and chose to mean only one. The fire in the drawing room made no sound, she could separate from the sound of the blood in her ears. She looked at a painting on the far wall, a landscape with a gray sky and a copse of bare trees, and she studied it with the intensity of someone who has nothing in particular to study and is grateful for the excuse. She thought about what it meant to have allowed herself. Over 17 days of a November, she had expected to find merely endurable, to begin to hope. She thought about hope as a form of recklessness. The specific recklessness of a woman who has been told in 1,000 small accumulated ways that the space she occupies in the world is contingent, managed, conditional on the agreement of people who do not, in the final account, require her approval. She had thought she was past that kind of recklessness. She had thought, arriving at Fenmore House in a carriage, with a trunk and a very plain heart, that she had left it behind somewhere in the road between her father's house and these stone gates. She had not, apparently, left it behind. She had simply, without meaning to, given it a new address. The dinner proceeded. Mrs. Hargrove complimented the pheasant and inquired about the Pelham family in a manner designed to be overheard. Lady Fenmore received the inquiry with a small, correct smile. The daughter of the Hargroves played the pianoforte, not badly, and received the polite praise. Such situations required. Cecily ate what was put before her and smiled at the appropriate moments and maintained the posture of a woman who is entirely at peace in her situation, which was, after all these years, the posture she wore best. Aldrich sat at the head of the table and did not look at her. She was certain of this in the way one is, certain of something one has been watching without admitting to watching. He spoke to the Hargrove husband about the drainage situation along the north field. He consulted Lady Fenmore about the candle order. Briefly, he did not, for the duration of the dinner, allow his dark eyes to find her end of the table. She told herself. This confirmed the corridor. She told herself a man whose intentions were clear would have no difficulty looking at his own wife, across his own table. She did not quite believe herself. She told herself anyway, because the alternative was to trust the November again, and look where trusting November had brought her. She went back into the drawing room. She found a chair near the piano and sat in it, and held her hands in her lap, one folded over the other, and looked at the fire, and did not permit herself to revisit the library, or the coat, or the wren, or the two figures bent over an unspecified task. She was the Brant arrangement. She had always known. She had simply, over the past several weeks, allowed herself to forget what she had always known. It was at this particular moment of her forgetting that the door opened, and Mr. Mend Quill was announced. She knew him by sight. A small, gray-haired solicitor from Ipswich, whom she had seen once at her father's house years ago, looking over papers at the desk. He did not look like a man who made a habit of arriving at drawing-room gatherings at 8 in the evening. He looked like a man who had been asked to come and had come, and who was carrying a leather case with the manner of someone whose errand was not casual. Lady Fenmore's eyes moved to him, and then to her son. Aldrich, who had been standing near the window, turned. He said to the room at large in his level, quiet register, "I asked Mr. Quill here this evening to confirm the settlement adjustments which he has drawn up at my instruction." "If you will excuse me for a moment, Lady Fenmore," said Aldrich. He was already crossing the room. He stopped before Cecily. He looked at her with the specific, direct attention she had first noticed at the church door, the attention that did not look through her but at her, and he said, "Will you come with me to the table?" It was not a question. She understood, very suddenly, that it was the opposite of a question. She rose and went with him to the side table where Mr. Quill had opened the leather case. There were several pages. Aldrich took them up and held them in his large, steady hands, and he read to her, in a low voice, meant for her, and not the room, what they said. Her jointure had been tripled. The Brant debt, all of it, was discharged, and the note destroyed. The Fenmore Dower House had been placed in trust for her use in the event of his death, with no reversion to the estate. The date on the documents was the 14th of November. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks before. Mrs. Hargrove's voice, 3 weeks before Nan's careful report. 3 weeks before the silence in the corridor. He had gone to London and done this 3 weeks ago. Without telling her, without requiring her to know. She was aware, in the hush between them, of the steadiness of his breath, the way his hands did not tremble on the pages, the particular gravity of his profile in the candlelight. She said very quietly, "You did this in November?" "Yes," he said, "before this evening." "Yes." She looked at the date on the page and could not speak. Across the room, Mrs. Hargrove had begun again. Something about the Brant arrangement had the difficulty of such situations, her voice carrying the pleasant certainty of a woman who has never once been wrong in her own hearing. Aldrich set the papers down. He turned. He crossed the drawing room in 3 long strides, and the room noticed him crossing it the way rooms always noticed him crossing them, and went correspondingly quieter, and he stopped at Cecily's side. And he did not look at Mrs. Hargrove. He looked at Cecily. He said, in the room's new quiet, in his level, contained voice that derived its authority from stillness, rather than volume, "Cecily is my wife. I chose her. There is nothing else." No one spoke. Lady Fenmore's fan stopped moving. Mrs. Hargrove's mouth closed on whatever it had been preparing. Mr. Quill, at the side table, folded his papers. Somewhere in the house, a clock marked the half-hour. Cecily looked at her husband and felt something in her chest perform the careful, almost frightening action of opening. Lady Fenmore was the first to recover. She did so by saying, "To the room. Shall we have some music?" And the room, grateful for the instruction, reorganized itself accordingly, and the moment passed into the house's history without ceremony. It was not a triumph. It was not intended as one. It was simply the truth, stated once in the correct place, by the correct person at the correct volume. That was enough. The house changed after that. Or perhaps it had been changing for weeks and she had been too occupied with watching for cruelty to notice the warmth. In the mornings, he left a newspaper folded to the pages he had found interesting, on the corner of the breakfast table, without comment. She read them and sometimes left a pencil mark beside a passage and sometimes did not, and this too passed without comment, which was its own form of conversation. Thomas began to come to the library during the afternoon hours when Cecily sat there with her mending, and he brought his portfolio and spread his drawings across the second table, and the 3 of them occupied the same room in the quiet manner of people who have agreed silently to belong to the same place. She did not ask him about the dismissed steward for another fortnight. When she did, it was directly, sitting across the desk, the fire between them, while Thomas slept upstairs. He told her, in the same spare, careful sentences he used for everything that cost him, that the steward Merton had been taking a small percentage from each tenant's quarterly payment for 2 years, recording the full amount in the ledger, and pocketing the difference. He had dismissed him in November without a reference because a reference would have taken the man into another household to do the same thing, and he had paid the shortfall to the affected tenants himself and asked them not to speak of it because Merton had 3 children and he did not wish to have the man prosecuted. The request for silence had been the error. The silence had been misread. She looked at him across the desk for a long moment. She said, "You let them think the worst of you." He said, "I let it rest where it landed. That is not the same thing as being willing to be misread." He said nothing. She could see in the set of his face that he had not, until this moment, distinguished between the two. She went to the library window. The light was winter-thin and low and flat, and the wren's nest was still on the outer sill undisturbed, though the wren had gone south for the coldest weeks. She stood looking at the nest for a moment, and then she heard him cross the room to stand beside her, not close, the correct width of a room between them, and they stood together looking at the small, careful construction of grass and fine root and gathered domestic debris that the bird had made before it left. He said, "She will come back in March." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "She came back the March before." And the March before that? She thought about that. The prayer book was on the table behind them where he had set it down. She turned and looked at it, and then she looked at him. She said, Will you teach me the passage you read to Thomas, the one from the 3rd chapter? He looked at her. Something moved in his face that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it, the look of a man confronted by a thing he had not known he was waiting for. She picked up the book. It was lighter than she expected, and the leather was worn as soft as cloth at the spine, and the red ribbon lay between the pages like a held breath. He said, and his voice had something in it that had not been there before, or had been there and been quietly present all along, only now, without the guard, usually ran beneath. I did not want an arrangement. I wanted you to stay of your own choosing. She looked at the book in her hands. Then she looked at him. She said, then I will stay. The fire was low, and the library was warm, and outside the window the wren's nest sat on the sill with its patient. Gathered architecture, waiting for March. The house was quiet around them in the way of a house that has decided to be quiet, rather than merely empty. The difference being the kind of difference she had spent the better part of a year learning to hear. Thomas's drawing was pinned to the wall, 3 figures before a house, their outlines penciled in with the small, sure confidence of someone who has decided they belong. In the picture, she opened the prayer book to the 3rd chapter, and held it so they could both see the page. She was aware of the warmth of the lamp, and of his stillness beside her, the particular quality of attention that had always been there, and that she had spent too many weeks trying to classify as coldness rather than care. He did not move closer. He did not need to. The space between them had changed. In the weeks since the church door, in increments so small she had not marked any of them singly. And now the space was simply the space between 2 people who have chosen the same room, not because they were arranged there, but because there was nowhere else they wished to be. She read the first line aloud in her steady, quiet voice, and the words went up into the warm library air, and he listened, and the house settled around them, ancient and stone and slower than all of it. The ribbon lay in her palm like something given freely. If Cecily's story has found you in an evening quiet of your own, leave a word for it in the comments below. Some stories want only to be heard.